At this point, I've done so many videos about being an Uber driver and a Lyft driver, and I've talked a lot about the pros and the cons. And this is one question I've gotten a lot from a lot of different people saying, hey Mark, I know there's probably a lot of benefits to being an Uber and Lyft driver, but give me the inside scoop. What are the negative parts about being a driver? Why shouldn't somebody drive? So in this video, I'm gonna take a very devil's advocate perspective and talk about 7 reasons why you shouldn't drive for Lyft and drive for Uber. Number 1, if you live in a bad area. Now, I'm not talking about a dangerous area, I'm talking about a bad area to drive in. I've said this before in so many of my other videos, but overall, the number one factor that determines how much money you can make as a driver is your location. And if you take somebody in New York, for example, and then someone in Ohio, even if they drive during the same exact hours, they drive the same and whatnot, the person in New York will make more money than the person in Ohio. Just for whatever reason, your location is actually the biggest factor that determines how much money you can make. This is a survey that Rideshare did. They do this every year, and this just shows that as unfortunate as it is, your location just really determines your overall income. So if you do live in, like, say, an area that's not the best to drive in, honestly, I don't think it's worth it to drive. Number 2, non-peak hours. Now, let's say if you came and you said, hey, Mark, I really want to drive for Lyft and Uber, but I can only drive, I'm making this up, like Monday through Friday, 11 a.m. to 2 or 3 p.m. That's when I can only drive. The truth is, you could try it out, but I don't know if you'd make a lot of money. I remember when I was driving, I would try driving during the non-peak hours, and let's be honest, let's say Tuesday at 11 a.m. is kind of a vague time to drive. I might make $4 or $5 an hour. And if you can only drive during those non-peak hours when there's not a lot of activity, I don't think it's worth it to drive. I don't think you should drive at all. Now, I will say this is changing state by state. Some states are now exploring the idea of having Lyft and Uber drivers not be independent contractors, but become employees. If that does happen in your state, you might have a minimum hourly guarantee. Even in California, Prop 22 passed, and when it passed, even though drivers are staying as independent contractors, they now have a minimum hourly guarantee. So that actually might help you out, that maybe given the way your state is, maybe that minimum hourly guarantee is actually good enough where you can still drive during the non-peak hours. That way, at least you know you're guaranteed that the worst case scenario is that you make that minimum hourly guarantee during the non-peak hours. But remember, when it comes to driving for Lyft and driving for Uber, the number one thing is to drive during the peak hours. That's when you can make the most amount of money. So I'm talking about morning and evening commutes, Friday and Saturday nights. Number 3, the car situation. This can bring up a whole can of worms because on one end, let's say you have your own car and you're like, look, I want to drive for Lyft and Uber, I have my own car. Well, there's a couple things you have to keep in mind. One, remember, you're putting a lot more depreciation on your car, just overall wear and tear. Number 2, a lot of dealerships now, let's say you want to sell your car, one of the first questions I ask you now is, has this car ever been used for any ride-sharing or taxi-like service, such as Lyft or Uber? And they actually might give you less money for your vehicle because you drove for Lyft and drove for Uber. Now, Uber and Lyft does have programs where you can rent a car through them. Every situation is different when it comes to renting a car with Lyft and Uber, and this also changes over time as well. But I remember one of my friends had her own car, and she still rented through Uber, and it was $200 a week for her to rent that car through Uber. She loved it. She drove full time, so she's like, look, I don't put all this wear and tear on my car. I'd much rather spend $200 a week. However, if, like, say you're like, okay, I want to drive for Lyft and Uber, but I don't have a car, I'll just rent one, and you only make $180 in a week, well, you're now losing $20 every week. Every situation is different when it comes to renting. I remember there was a period of time where Lyft was saying, hey, if you did over, I think it was like 68 rides in a week, we'll actually give you the rental car for free to use. So every situation is a little bit different, and this does change over time. So make sure you look into the fine details and read the fine print if you are looking to rent a car with Lyft and Uber. But that's something to keep in mind, that if you do, let's say, have to pay money to rent that car, you have to make that certain amount just to break even. Number 4, how much you have to rely on that income. This is a big one that you might not expect, and this is becoming, I'm finding, more of an unfortunate thing when it comes to Lyft and Uber, and that is deactivations are becoming significantly more common. In case you don't know, and again, this varies state by state, but typically you're an independent contractor when driving for Lyft and driving for Uber. There's some pros to that and some cons. And one massive con is you don't really get a lot of rights. So if, let's say, you came and you said, hey Mark, I want to drive for Lyft and Uber because I'm going to use this money for putting food on the table, for paying bills, etc., and you're going to completely rely on that income, I'd say, you know what? Maybe you shouldn't drive. Maybe you should do something else. Now, if you're, let's say, you're doing Lyft and Uber part-time and you already have a full-time job and you're doing it just to make side cash, okay, that's one thing. But I think if you have to drive for Lyft and Uber and you're relying on that income, I'd just be a little bit worried. I've seen so many comments on this channel of drivers telling me, hey Mark, I was driving for Lyft and Uber full-time, I was relying on that income, I woke up the next morning and for really no reason, my account got deactivated and I got terminated. And now I do not know what to do to pay my bills, to support my family financially, etc. This is just a very unfortunate thing about Lyft and Uber, and I guess most independent contractor jobs as well. But I think especially with Lyft and Uber, because it's a customer-based service, which I'll get into a little bit later in this video, because it's a customer-based service, if let's say you have a minor dispute with a passenger, Lyft and Uber will most likely take the side of the passenger over you. And sometimes that equals deactivation and termination. And again, if you're, let's say, going into this, if you're, let's say, going into rideshare driving to solely rely on that income, I would highly suggest choosing something else. Number 5, doing it full time. This, I'm gonna make this pretty quick on this point. Just don't do it. Now look, there are so many drivers I know who I've met and also have commented on this channel saying, hey Mark, I drive full time and I make bank, I do great. However, I still think you don't really know how much money you can make through Lyft and Uber and how it's overall gonna go until you start driving. That's why I suggest for a lot of people, if you are looking to drive, do not jump into it full time. Like I said, not only because of you relying on that income, like I mentioned in the past point, but also your location. Maybe you're in an area that is just really bad to drive in, like I mentioned in point 1. Or maybe it's the opposite. If you look at Ohio and Florida, for example, they're typically bad states to drive in. However, maybe just given the area that you're in is actually a lot better than the average and you can make really good money being a driver. But the truth is, you don't know. And overall, it's so weird that Lyft and Uber is just a big roll of the dice where you just don't know sometimes how much money you can make until you start driving. And that's why I suggest always start off part-time. Do not jump into it full-time. Start off part-time. Like say you start making great money, then transition to full-time. Awesome. But at least if you start off part-time, you can really test the waters out and figure out, should I drive or shouldn't I drive? Number 6, the legal and insurance stuff. I'll word that vaguely. There are so many little things that come into driving. I mean, one, especially with the legal aspects, remember, and this is kind of unfortunate to say, statistically speaking, the more that you drive, the more that you're on the road, the more chance there is of you getting into an accident. So of course, insurance is important. Now, Lyft and Uber does have some insurance protocols in place, but this varies state by state. There's a lot of, as you can imagine with insurance, a lot of very fine print stuff involved, and there's just so many different factors. But remember too, if you are driving for Lyft and Uber, make sure that your car insurance knows about that. And one of the biggest things when it comes to getting insurance, make sure you do, one of the first questions they ask you is, are you planning on doing any ride sharing or taxi-like services such as Lyft and Uber? And if so, it makes sense that your insurance will probably go up. And that's another factor to consider. Also, if actually you are planning on driving full-time, you're gonna have to get your own health insurance. And at least here in America, if you've never gotten your own health insurance, let's just say it's quite the experience. So there are a bunch of different factors overall that really do come into play with being a driver. And one huge pro tip I'm gonna give on the side is get a dash cam. This is something that hopefully you will never have to use, but there have been more and more reports when it comes to the legal aspects of Lyft and Uber where drivers are getting into a dispute with the passengers attack the drivers, something happens, or like say if you get into an accident, a dash cam records both in front of you and in your car. That way you always have the footage as evidence just in case. Just get a dash cam if you are planning on driving. It will save you a lot of hassle and the worst case scenario that something happens. Number 7, health reasons. I know this is a weird one on number 7, But I wanted to mention this because I noticed that when I was driving, and I drove both part-time and full-time, when I was driving full-time, it blew my mind of how big of a toll it actually took on my health. We've probably seen all these studies and reports and research that's showing, look, sitting is the new smoking. And I'm a former accountant, and at least when I was an accountant working at your cliche cubicle, which was horrible, at least I could still like stand up every 15 or 20 minutes. I could walk around. I could at least, stretch out a little bit or whatever. However, though, when you're driving, it's a lot trickier, right? Especially if you're driving in the city. And remember, if you drive in the city, that's when you make the most money by far. It's not as easy or feasible to get out of the car every 20 or 30 minutes and stretch. I mean, when I would drive, I'd pretty much be sitting for my entire duration. I'd really never stand up unless I had to like stop and go to the bathroom or something like that. I'd be sitting the entire time. And I know this is like a weird point to mention on this video, but like I said, it was pretty alarming of just how more winded I felt when I was working out in general. I felt a lot more lethargic. Just the overall sitting, and I think especially too, sitting with almost zero breaks surprisingly hit me harder than I expected. And last, a bonus reason is the people. Now, this is both a pro and a con depending on who you are. I've had people hit me up saying, hey Mark, I want to be a Lyft and Uber driver, but I'm not that talkative. I'm more of an introvert. That's okay. You don't have to be this crazy big talkative person when it comes to being a driver. However, I think sometimes one thing you have to remember is you are, whether you like it or not, in the customer service industry. I used to bartend, and I feel like that when you're a bartender, as most people can imagine, not only are you a bartender, understanding how to make drinks, mixology, etc., but you're also a low-key therapist, right? People come to the bar, they talk about what's been going on, especially with alcohol involved. So you kind of have to do both, right? You can't really get into bartending, in my opinion, and not want to talk to anybody. It's part of the job. If anything, it's almost 50-50. Half my job when I was bartending was just talking to people and the social interaction. The other half was bartending. I just wanted to mention this because although you don't have to be the most talkative person, you do have to have that kind of customer service mindset in mind when driving. That you're gonna have to deal with a lot of unique situations, a lot of people asking you questions and just wanting to have conversation, so on and so forth, And don't get me wrong, I've been in so many Lyft and Ubers where I got in, the driver didn't talk to me, they just drove. But keep in mind though, when driving, you're gonna have, like I said, a lot of situations where you have to be talking to people, have to be interacting, you have to solve issues when it comes to customer service stuff. There may be some discrepancies when someone was expecting one thing, but they got something else, etc. Just part of working in customer service. One thing I do want to say as a quick side note is I find most people are nice. Most people are very personable. I find it's about half and half, even too, where some people get in the car and they jump right on their phone. Other people might be a little bit more talkative. So most people are pretty nice. So that's just part of the customer service industry. And that's one thing I'd say just to keep in mind.